Welcome to our latest explainer. For nearly 2 millennia, a massive historical mystery has basically been hiding in plain sight. Today, we're totally challenging centuries of established assumptions about one of history's most famous figures. I am genuinely thrilled to guide you through this, because the historical evidence we're going to look at today, it fundamentally shifts our understanding of the ancient world and the texts we thought we knew so well. Okay, let's dive into this. For roughly 1900 years, scholars and everyday folks alike have referred to a specific collection of the Apostle Paul's writings as the prison letters, right? It's just a foundational assumption in biblical history that Paul wrote these while locked up in a jail cell. But when we actually strip away our preconceived notions and look strictly at the historical data and the actual language he used, a massive discrepancy pops up. What if the very concept of Paul writing from a prison is entirely historically inaccurate? Section 1. The Prison Myth. To understand how we got this so wrong, we really have to look at the universally accepted baseline. The traditional story of Paul's captivity comes almost entirely from a secondary source, the Book of Acts. Acts gives us this very specific, incredibly dramatic itinerary of his incarcerations. It details a one-night jailing in Philippi, a lengthy 2-year stint under the governor Felix in Caesarea Maritima, and finally, an extended period of comfortable house arrest in Rome. Because of this narrative, almost all historians have just instinctively assumed that Paul's letters from captivity absolutely must have been written in one of these 3 specific locations. Section 2, Acts versus the letters. So here's where we hit a massive historical roadblock. Biblical historian John Knox famously realized we've been reading the evidence entirely backward. Knox established a crucial rule for historical inquiry. When we're reconstructing Paul's life, we essentially have 2 main sources. And guys, they are not equal. On one side, we have Paul's own epistles. These are primary sources. They offer direct, first-hand autobiographical evidence. On the other side, we have the Book of Acts, which is a secondary source written way later. And Knox pointed out that Acts demonstrably prefers developing sweeping dramatic narrative themes over accurate historical reporting. Therefore, when there's a conflict, the primary source, Paul's own letters, must always take precedence over Acts. Yet despite Knox's incredibly logical rule, historians keep making the exact same mistake. Why? Well, the sociologist Pierre Bourdieu used the term doxa to describe this phenomenon. Doxa is something so deeply taken for granted that it literally defines the boundaries of what's thinkable and unthinkable. The narrative of Acts has achieved such a powerful level of doxa that even highly secular, skeptical scholars unintentionally project the Book of Acts onto Paul's letters. They simply can't imagine Paul's life outside the framework Acts created. And when we rigorously cross-examine Acts, we find that its prison narratives read a lot more like an entertaining ancient Greek novel than a factual historical log. It relies heavily on these novelistic tropes: villainous accusers striking the hero, the protagonist magically wielding high social status and Roman citizenship to get out of trouble, miraculous earthquakes conveniently opening prison doors, and ultimately, a respectable, cushy house arrest. It's basically an ancient action movie script. It presents Paul as an elite man of means, but this directly contradicts Paul's own letters, where he describes himself as socially weak, doing hard manual labor, and frequently subjected to humiliating beatings. Section 3, Lost in Translation. So, if we bracket out the fictionalized drama of Acts, what do Paul's own letters actually say? Let's act as historical detectives for a second. Now, Paul certainly knows the Greek word for prison, philiki. He uses it when recounting the sheer number of hardships he's faced over his life. In 2 Corinthians, he states, "I have been in prisons more frequently." But here is the massive historical catch. He exclusively uses this word to describe past events. At no point in any of his letters does he ever use the word prison to describe his present writing situation. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the precise language Paul does use. When writing from captivity, Paul completely strips away the word prison. Instead, he repeatedly describes himself using the Greek phrase en tois deismos, which translates literally to being in chains. In our modern Bibles, translators often smooth this over and kind of lazily translate it as prison or imprisonment, but that entirely misses the grim reality of the ancient text. You see, in Greco-Roman antiquity, being in chains was a broad term for shackled captivity. It could mean being a prisoner of war, being kidnapped by pirates, or simply being a slave. Furthermore, historians point out that formal prison sentences basically didn't even exist in the Roman Empire. Prisons were merely short-term holding cells where you waited for a few days to be executed or punished. A long-term stay in a prison building for a lower-class citizen, It was practically unheard of.
Section 4. The Convict Labor Theory.
If Paul wasn't in a prison building, and he certainly wasn't wealthy enough for house arrest, what does it actually mean for a poor man to be in chains for an extended period? Well, the most common form of long-term punishment for lower-class individuals in the Roman Empire was damnatio ad metallum, condemnation to the mines. This was a harrowing, grueling, forced labor sentence. Convicts were stripped of their property, formed into massive chain gangs, had their heads half-shaved for identification, and were sent to perform agonizing physical labor. It was a place where the impoverished were essentially sent to die. And this brilliantly illustrates how the clues in Paul's letters map perfectly onto the reality of the Roman mines, rather than a cushy house arrest. Look at the data. In his letters, Paul mentions interacting with Caesar's household. Well, historians know that imperial slaves from the emperor's household were the ones who administered the imperial mines and quarries. Paul writes about bearing the physical brands of Jesus on his body. Mine convicts were subjected to penal tattooing and branding on their faces to prevent escape. And finally, Paul writes with deep despair, openly contemplating his imminent death. This makes perfect sense, as condemnation to the mines was legally viewed as a form of capital punishment. But you might be wondering, could someone actually write sophisticated letters while doing convict labor? The answer is a resounding yes, and the proof is the number 896. That is the exact number of ostraca, which are broken pieces of pottery used as writing surfaces, found at the Mons Claudiana's prison mine in Egypt. Think about it. This massive collection of correspondence proves without a doubt that writing letters, asking for help, and building communities from within a forced labor camp was an entirely historically plausible scenario. Section 5. Why this matters. This is a massive shift in how we view early historical texts, but it goes deeper than that. So, the crucial point is this. Clinging to the myth created by the Book of Acts isn't just a harmless historical error. Sanitizing Paul's history into a polite story of respectable house arrest actually does a tremendous disservice to reality. It actively obscures and erases the gritty, brutal, state-sponsored violence that Paul, as a socially vulnerable person, likely endured. History is often written to make the past more comfortable for those in power. The author of Acts crafted a strong, respectable, and elite Paul because that was way more palatable to the hegemonic politics of the time. But it forces us to ask a profound question of ourselves. By continuing to blindly favor this sanitized narrative, what other vulnerable, gritty histories of state violence and suffering are we continuing to erase today? It's a powerful reminder to always question the narratives we take for granted and to look closely at the chains of the past. Thank you for joining me for this explainer.